I was, of course, a colleague of Howard's at the Institute of Development Studies for many years, and we had a very nice time in the Gambia once, I think, when he tried to persuade me to run at 6 o'clock in the morning because he's dedicated to running, and I am not. However, our paths have diverged since then, so it's very good to see him again, and I think only for him would I have taken time out from a very packed day today to rush over here and do a presentation, and very much in the line of work that he's been doing. So this presentation, as you can see, is looking at the economic impacts of conditional cash transfers. It was, let me just get some water. It was funded by DFID, and it was one of the first of these.
Okay.
And it was one of the first of the systematic reviews that it published at the time, and since then there have been quite a few. So we were, in a sense, really struggling to find out how one does this, and we got advice from 3IE, from Hugh and Berta and Martina. And the reason, and this was a question that I was interested in very much, and so by economic impacts, we were actually trying to look at a range of impacts that these programs had not set out to achieve. So conditional cash transfers of the kind that we're talking about here are regular transfers of money, mainly to women within the household, on condition that they take their children to put their children in school, girls and boys, and that they take them on a regular basis to health clinics. So the impacts they were trying to achieve was greater investment in children's human capital. But we were asking a slightly different question, which is what else did they achieve, and to what extent were these other achievements, could we interpret them as economic? And in this paper, we define economic to mean any impacts on the productive activity and resources of the household and the local economy. So we've included impacts on household labor allocation, migration patterns, how household budgets are allocated, savings, investments, and so on. And why were we interested? Well, first of all, because it is actually interesting. And it is interesting because it tells us a little bit more. It throws a different kind of light on how households operate, both internally and also in relation to the wider community of which households are a part. But it is also interesting because, in a sense, it strengthens the case for conditional cash transfers. Because it says, look, not only does it achieve higher schooling, if it does, but it also has these other economic impacts, hopefully positive, which make the case for conditional policies stronger. So, in a sense, we were moving away from the theory of change that, in a sense, informs these conditional cash transfers and coming up with our own theory of change. So the theory of change that has been summarized for these includes the income effect, which is it lifts households' liquidity constraints in contexts where there are imperfect or missing markets in credit and insurance, that it increases the opportunity cost of not sending children to school and not taking them to the clinic. So there's a substitution effect, and to some extent the cash transfers offset the misguided beliefs of parents about what the returns to education might be. Many parents don't have any idea what the returns to education might be, or they have a tendency to discount the future at a rate that is not compatible with the child's interests. So to some extent, cash transfers help to address this. And finally, there is the belief of a gender-specific impact, and that is that it is believed that mothers' preferences are more closely aligned to children's interests than fathers. And so giving money to women will achieve better results in terms of children's. So our theory of change said that the lifting of liquidity constraints that we're talking about can accommodate much more than investments in children's human capital. That lifting liquidity constraints may actually allow for uses of household income across a wider set of options than simply focusing on children's education and health. In terms of substitution effects, we would argue that the reallocation of children's time away from work, away from domestic chores, or in some cases from play, will have to result in a reallocation in the time of adults. So we want to know to what extent that reallocation has an economic impact. And finally, gender-specific effects. All the economic impacts that are made possible by cash transfers are likely to be mediated by gender. So the fact that this money is going to women may impact on labor allocation, may impact on investments in a way that differs from what would happen if it had gone to men. And finally, we were talking about the spillover, possible spillover effects in the community, either because there's more money available, which may lead to inflation, or it may lead to other forms of change, or there might be demonstration changes because people who are recipients are behaving differently, sending their children to school, and this might have an impact on the rest of the community. So we were also looking out for spillover effects. Okay. The process is a fairly standard one. We used a number of search terms and, downloaded a whole lot of literature that looked relevant. Then we went through them and we discarded, and the literature was mainly from 1990 to 2010. We discarded all those that didn't deal with impact evaluations. We discarded all those that didn't deal with economic impacts at all. And then we used the ranking of methodologies, the Maryland, whatever it was called, scientific method scale, and we excluded all studies that did not use experimental RCTs or quasi-experimental methods. And we did that partly because we had a budget constraint, a time constraint, and partly because we wanted to see what using this very rigorous criteria would throw up by way of illuminating impacts. So by the time that we had done all our excluding and including, we ended up with, I think, 46 papers, and they related to 11 separate programs, all of them in Latin America except for one in Pakistan. These were the ones that met the criteria that we had set. So, if we look at the impacts, the first set of impacts is about child labor. And what we found is that in general, conditional cash transfers increased children's education. That was fairly, across the board. But their impacts on the trade-off between work and school varied by age, by gender, by ethnicity, and by location. This partly reflects variations in initial conditions. It reflects who was already going to school and who was not. So if boys were more likely to go to school, then the impact was likely to be larger for girls. Also, the kind of work that people were doing. In many cases, boys were involved in forms of paid labor, market labor, that could not be easily reconciled with schooling. So we often found larger impacts for boys. Girls were very often involved in domestic chores, and that could be reconciled with schooling, and therefore we might find a smaller impact on girls' labor. Rural locations reported larger impacts because the wages that people could earn were much lower relative to the transfers, and the opportunity costs of sending children to school was also much lower. The impacts were much larger among poorer children, as we might expect, because the need for an income was greater amongst them, amongst ethnic minority children, and so on. So the impacts on education were fairly unequivocal. We didn't find any evidence that conditional cash transfers reduced children's education, but their impact on child labor varied a lot by household income and what children were doing ahead of them. The evidence on adult labor was far less consistent and far more difficult to interpret. So for instance, in urban Uruguay, we found that both men and women reduced their supply into paid work. In Brazil, we found a positive effect on adult labor, but not on female labor and not in certain regions of Brazil. Again, positive effects on people looking for work, but not in certain parts of Brazil. So there was a lot of regional variations, which tells you something about the context in which these programs are playing out. And very often the impact varied by the size of the transfer. So for medium-sized transfers, you very often found a much greater likelihood of women not working or withdrawing from work than you did for small and large. But there is no real explanation as to why this is the case, so one has to try and kind of induce, or what's the word, deduce, what the reasons might be. And in Mexico, they had no impact on adult labor force, but it may have moved occupations out of self-employment and into waged work. No impact in Chile, and in Pakistan, mothers ended up spending more time in household work because their daughters were presumably going to school, and reduced their market work. So all in all, the story on adult labor allocation was very varied and somewhat inconsistent. Migration patterns, again, contradictory finding. All these studies come from Mexico, very contradictory findings. One set of findings says there was increased migration to US, but no change in domestic rates. And the increase into US migration was largely because of newer households now being able to send migrants to the US. Another study said that it slowed down the pace of increasing migration. Particularly, it slowed it down for migration to the US. So you had very, opposite findings as far as the US migration was concerned. A third study said it reduced migration, both domestic and US, among young men, but no impact on women. And a fourth one said that villages that participated in these cash transfer programs reported higher migration, some of it as a part of overall increase, but some of it because of the programs, and that the rates of migration were higher for men than women, but the differential was lower near a railway station, where access was easier. So the contradictions appear to reflect the fact that some used individual and some used household data, and it also appeared to reflect whether or not you believe that the pre-program rates of migration differed between the two areas. And as I'm not very familiar with these conditions, some say they were no different in the past, and that's why you find no difference later, and some say there was a big difference. The size of the grant, what is that?
That's a translation.
Okay.
That's for him.
All right. So the size of the grant made a big difference. Small size grants had very little impact on migration. Large size grants did. And conditionality, how well it was enforced, made a difference. So if the conditions attached to secondary school, then migration was much less, because I think parents had to make sure that children went to school and so on, and the likelihood that adult male migrated was less. The next set of impacts we looked at was consumption. Now, of course, the transfers increase income, but what we found was that there was an overall increase in both total and in food consumption. Food consumption partly because of the poverty of the households, but it also was not just an increase in calories, but a shift to more nutritious food, which may have reflected the impact of the training that accompanied some of the cash transfer programs. And there was some evidence of spillover effects in that communities with these programs also reported a greater diversity of diet than communities without. One study actually suggested that the increase in food consumption reflected an income effect, that it was simply an addition to overall household income, rather than the fact that it was going through women. But it was contested by another study that showed that conditional cash transfers, and this was an interesting one because it was one that looked very explicitly at causality. And it showed that households with conditional cash transfers, women had a greater role in decision making, particularly around the areas in which you had an increased expenditure. So it suggested that channeling the money through women was indeed explained by their greater decision-making power around certain areas of household expenditure. And it was further supported by the fact that households headed only by men or by women, the transfers were treated like any other income, but in dual or couple-headed households, the transfers were treated separately from other house income flows and were spent in ways that were different from other household flows. So in a sense, the study concludes by saying that if you allow for the fact that men and women's preferences might differ within the household, this actually muddles up Engels' law. That because women are much more likely to spend their money in food consumption, the law that says, the percentage of the budget that is reduced as income goes up, doesn't hold as strongly for women as it does for men. Savings and expenditure, savings and investment. Again, fairly systematic evidence that access to transfers led to increased investment in productive activity and in assets, in agricultural related expenses and in purchase of livestock. There was much more consumption of home produced food amongst landless and smallholder households, not so much amongst the better off. And those who did not have land prior to the transfer were able to enter into productive activity and expand it, but the largest impact were found among smallholder farms, which suggests that they were experiencing a liquidity constraint as far as investing in assets and agricultural related inputs were concerned. And there was also some evidence of gender differentiated investments, and that is cash transfers, since they are going through women, were very much more often were more likely to be spent on assets that could be controlled by women, i.e. smaller livestock and so on. So these transfers were being used to increase household economic activities, but they were also being used in ways that were of direct benefit to the women who received the transfers. However, this is all from Mexico. In Nicaragua, less evidence. And it is not clear why that might be the case, and one possibility is that the infrastructure is much poorer in Nicaragua than in Mexico. Another set of impacts was about how you coped with crisis and dealt with risk. And here you found that in both Mexico and Honduras, cash transfers helped to mitigate the likelihood that you took your children out of school if the household head was ill or unemployed. So it moderated the crisis coping effects in terms of children's education. It did not affect previous risk-sharing arrangements in Mexico, such as remittances and so on. And it did help to insulate consumption levels from fluctuations in income flows. In Nicaragua as well, there was no evidence that it crowded out remittances, nor did it influence, but it did not influence households' decisions to get loans, which was much more influenced by the fact that households were either engaged in microenterprise or that they received transfers. And finally, the community-wide effects, again, mainly from Mexico. We found that the studies found that food consumption for non-cash transfer programs in households with these programs had increased compared to households where there were no such programs. They were able to borrow more, presumably, and they received more in transfers from other households. We also found health effects, that children were more likely, there were fewer days of sickness reported in these villages, and demonstration effects, that children in households in these program villages were likely to stay on in school much longer than children in villages which did not have these programs. And one study examined poverty, and it found that in the villages with the transfer programs, the relative poverty line, which I think was the lowest 25% or something, that there was a reduction in poverty, in the poverty gap, and in squared poverty gap. And the decrease was even stronger in poverty when you excluded the richest 1% from the sample. So, now as you know, three of us produced this paper. Two of them were very good econometricians. The third was not. And the third was me. And so the colleague who did the work on this, the colleagues are, of course, not here to present. So I will try and muddle my way through this. But Hugh has helped me a little. And I think if I come to a complete halt or freeze, Hugh knows this work very well, so he will be able to step in. So, and one of the reasons we thought it was worth presenting this is a lot of these studies have not carried out the meta-analysis. And as far as I understand, it's useful to carry this out because it allows you to pool across a large number of different studies, which may have very different sample sizes, report very different confidence levels, and so on. And basically what they do is they calculate the average effect of treatment compared to non-treatment. And that zero line suggests that there has been no effect at all. So if you find a point on the zero line, it suggests that there has not been any effect. In the case of child labor, a positive effect is negative, right? You want to see a reduction in child labor, and that would be a positive impact. So we're looking for studies to show us that the effect is to the left of the zero line. And as you can see, all of these studies except one is to the left of the zero line. In other words, all of the studies are suggesting a reduction in child labor as a result of the conditional cash transfers. And the one that is not, is considered a null effect because actually the confidence intervals are too wide to allow us to have much faith in the results. And what, as far as I understand, I'm being very cautious here, the advantage here is you are able to pool findings from a whole number of different studies and to try and get a level of power that will give you confidence in your final results, which is there in the red circle. And as you see, when we've done this exercise, we find that there is a significant negative impact on child labor if we pool across all the different countries. What it also shows you is that, yes, there is a reduction, but of varying size in the different countries and with different confidence intervals. Okay? Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay? I haven't misled you in any way. So that tells us that if we take advantage of the availability of all these different studies, different sample sizes, etc., and make sort of some robust controls for all of this, we can have some faith in the fact that, yes, indeed, CCTs reduce child labor. If we disaggregate child labor by gender, we find actually that the difference for girls and boys is not that large. Although when we look at the studies, we find some studies are reporting much larger effects for boys, etc. But when we pool the findings, the difference is not that large. Adult labor, as you know, various studies showed all kinds of different results. Sometimes disincentives, sometimes incentives, sometimes it was women, sometimes it was men. And that is reproduced in this. So this is showing us very little impact on adult labor, but it's also showing a great variation. In some cases, adult labor went up, in some cases it went down. So in a sense, this allows us to capture, in a very summarized way, all the heterogeneity that we have seen from all the different studies. And here is household consumption, and here, as you see, all of them have a positive impact on household consumption, which is a good thing, and a roughly 10% increase on average. So cash transfers not only increase children's education, reduce child labor, they also increase household consumption, which adds up to a very strong policy argument for these kinds of conditional cash transfers in those countries where child labor and children's education has proved intransigent in terms of policy response. Okay. So by way of conclusion, I think what we could say is that the evidence is still scarce. As you see, we had only 46 studies, and they were about 11 programs. And almost all of them, to meet the criteria that we had set, are from Latin America, apart from the one in Pakistan. So very geographically restricted. We don't know how our findings might vary if we were looking at conditional cash transfers in Africa or Asia or anywhere else. Secondly, the evidence is stronger and more consistent for some impacts than for others. And in particular, as you saw, it's very strong for education, and it's very strong for child labor, and it's very strong for consumption. It's not so strong for adult labor effects, less strong for migration, and so on. And there are very few studies on the economy-wide impacts, which basically look at villages with and without these programs. Thirdly, I think that because of the budgetary and time constraints, we had to restrict our analysis to a manageable number of studies. So we chose to go what is, the gold standard way, which is to only choose those studies which had experimental and non-experimental methodologies. But what that actually helped to highlight is how little attention or how little illumination is provided by way of causal mechanisms. And if you restrict them to these studies as they were at the time, there is a lot of the causality is inferred, but not actually tested, not part of the story of change that the study is trying to tell. Now, partly this is because a lot of these studies used, data sets that had been designed by someone a while ago, right? So they didn't actually have time to design their own data sets to explore possible causal mechanisms. But I think also there wasn't that much interest. A lot of these studies are simply about, if you like, econometric analysis and, identified significance of impacts, but not all that interested in looking at the causality. If we had increased, as people now recognize is probably the gold standard way, if we had combined our econometric studies with a larger number of qualitative studies, I suspect we would have got a much, much richer analysis of these very interesting programs and the variations in their impacts across the world. So by way of conclusion, we can say that conditional cash transfers appear to have achieved what they set out to achieve, and they've also had some additional economic impacts, but that the significance of these vary by the program design, whether it goes on to secondary education or not, how large the transfers are, etc., by individual characteristics, the age of the child, the gender of the child, the age, the gender of the adults in the household, and by ethnicity. I know, for instance, a qualitative study of Progressa, the Mexican cash transfer programs, tells us that the daughters of Progressa, the daughters who benefited from the Progressa program, are now occupying better occupations than their mothers did. So Progressa has helped girls to go, and it has also helped to close gender and ethnic disparities. So this has taken place over a period of 10, 12 years. So we need a certain amount of time for some of the longer term impacts to be captured. And of course, the self-employed are going to be impacted on differently from the wage-employed and so on. And then I think the real, if you like, it's not the who done it, but why did it happen of these studies is the context. Why in Nicaragua did the conditional cash transfer not appear to help people, protect people from the fall in coffee prices, and yet it had finished. And yet it had very important risk coping effects in Mexico. So there is something about the wider context that I think is extremely important in the how did it happen part of the story.
Thank you.